The wind was a thief in that high, desolate country, stealing warmth from the blood and sound from the air. It had scoured the land down to bone and rock, leaving only stubborn things to survive. Alara was one of them. She knelt in the dust, the cold seeping through the knees of her worn trousers. Her world shrunk to the man bleeding out before her. He was broad-shouldered, his life leaking from 2 dark holes in his back, the silver of a sheriff's star on his vest tarnished with dirt and despair. His breath was a shallow rasp, a counterpoint to the ceaseless moan of the wind across the plains. She didn't know his name, or why he'd collapsed 100 yards from the sod-walled homestead that was both her sanctuary and her prison. She only knew the look in a hunted animal's eyes, and that a man left to the mercy of the coming night was a man left to die. With a strength born of solitude and sorrow, she hooked her arms under his and dragged him. He was a dead weight, a burden of stone and failing flesh. Every foot of ground was a battle, his boots scoring twin lines in the dirt, a testament to her struggle. Inside the small cabin, the air was still and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was a fragile peace, one she had cultivated for 2 years, and his presence shattered it instantly. She laid him on her cot, the rough wool blanket a stark contrast to his pale skin. The fire in the hearth was low, a bed of weary orange embers. She stoked it back to life, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. With a basin of hot water and a clean rag, she set to work. Her hands, usually steady as she tended her small garden or stitched a seam, trembled slightly as she cut away the fabric of his shirt. The wounds were ugly, the flesh around them bruised and swollen. He was burning with fever. She found the first bullet shallowly lodged against a rib. Her breath hitched. She'd only ever done this for livestock. Taking a small, sharp knife from her kitchen block and a pair of pliers, she sterilized them in the fire until they glowed. He groaned as she probed the wound, his body tensing. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. It was more a command to herself than to him. The lead came free with a sickening pull. She dropped it into a metal dish where it landed with a heavy clink, a sound of finality. The second was deeper. As she worked, her fingers brushed against a network of old scars that mapped his back, a history of violence written on his skin. They felt like her own. On her forearm, hidden beneath her sleeve, was a brand. A cattle mark burned into her flesh by a man who had thought he owned her. She understood, in that silent, visceral way, that this stranger was no stranger at all. He was a kindred spirit, marked by the world's cruelty. She finished her work, packing the wounds with a poultice of yarrow and binding his torso with clean strips of linen. His breathing was deeper now, more even. She sat in the single wooden chair beside the cot, a rifle laid across her lap, and watched the shadows lengthen as dusk bled into a cold, star-filled night. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. He woke just before dawn. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found her immediately. They were sharp, assessing, the eyes of a man accustomed to sizing up a threat. "Where?" he rasped, his voice gravel. "My home," she said, not moving from her chair. He tried to sit up, a sharp intake of breath stopping him. He looked down at the bandages. "You did this." She gave a slight nod. "You would have died. Why?" The question was quiet, but it filled the small room. She looked at the fire, its light glinting off the rifle's barrel. No one should die alone in the dirt. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, seeing the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes, the fierce defensiveness in her posture. "They'll be coming," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a warning. It was a fact. "Who?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. His gaze flickered to the tarnished star on his discarded vest. "Men I trusted," the words were clipped, heavy with a betrayal that was clearly more painful than the bullets. He finally told her his name was Silas. He didn't ask for hers. In the gray morning light, he pushed himself to his feet, swaying, his hand pressed to the wall for support. He walked to the cabin's single window, peering out at the vast, empty horizon. His body was a study in controlled pain. Alara watched him, a fragile trust beginning to form in the space between them. He was a lawman, but he was broken. She was a fugitive from her own life, but she was a survivor. She rose and ladled some broth into a bowl, the first real food she'd offered. She held it out to him. He took it, their fingers brushing. It was a small, fleeting contact, but in the charged silence of the cabin, it felt like a pact. He drank the broth, his eyes never leaving the window. "You should go," he said, his back to her. "This isn't your fight." Alara looked around the small, sparse room. The sturdy timber walls she had sealed herself. The hearth she had rebuilt. The small shelf with its 3 worn books. It wasn't much, but it was the only place she had ever felt safe. The only place she had ever been her own person. "They're coming to my home," she replied, her voice low and steady. "That makes it my fight." Silas turned slowly, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. He saw it then, the same stubborn refusal to be broken that he nurtured in himself. He saw the faint outline of the brand on her arm where her sleeve had ridden up. He didn't ask. He didn't have to. The unspoken traumas hung in the air between them, creating a bond stronger than words. "There are 3 of them," he said, his tone shifting from warning to strategy. "The leader is Corbin. He was my deputy." The word was dripped with venom. "He's smart. And he has no conscience." Alara simply nodded. Moving to the ammunition box she kept under her bed, she began loading the rifle with calm, deliberate movements. Her hands were steady now. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. This cabin was her body. This land was her soul. No one would violate it again. As the sun began to crest the horizon, painting the rim of the world in brilliant, merciless orange, they saw them. 3 riders, black silhouettes against the dawn, moving with an unhurried certainty. They weren't hunting. They were collecting. Silas checked the revolver he'd kept tucked in his belt, the clicks of the cylinder loud in the tense quiet. He stood by the window, Alara by the door, 2 fractured souls bracing against a coming storm. "Get down when it starts," he ordered softly. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "So will you." A dry, ghost of a smile touched his lips. The riders pulled up 30 yards out. The man in the lead, Corbin, had a cruel, handsome face. He dismounted, his movements arrogant. "Silas," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "I know you're in there. We tracked you all night. Just give it up. The bounty is generous." Silas remained silent, his knuckles white on the grip of his gun. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Corbin continued, his tone conversational. "Don't trust the woman. Found her records in the last town. Branded and run out of Carson territory for theft and murder. She's no saint, Silas. She'll sell you for $1. The words were meant to be poison, to sever the fragile thread between them. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look at Alara. He didn't need to. He had seen the truth of her in her hands, her courage. "It's over, Corbin," Silas finally called out, his voice strong and clear, resonating with a newfound authority. The first shot came from one of the other riders. It splintered the window frame, showering the floor with wood and glass. The sanctuary was breached. The battle was instant and brutal. Silas fired from the window, his movements economical and precise despite his injuries. One of the riders fell from his horse. Alara, positioned at the door, fired the rifle. The kickback slammed into her shoulder, but her aim was true. The second rider's horse shied violently, throwing him. Corbin, using the distraction, charged the cabin. He kicked the door in, the wood groaning as it flew off its leather hinges. He and Silas met in the center of the small room, a clash of desperation and greed. It was not a gunfight. It was a raw, primal struggle. They crashed into the table, sending bowls and utensils scattering. Alara raised the rifle, but they were a tangled mess of limbs, no clear shot possible. Corbin was younger, stronger, but Silas fought with the fury of a man with nothing left to lose. A knife appeared in Corbin's hand. He lunged, but Silas, anticipating it, twisted, the blade slicing through his arm instead of his gut. Silas drove his head into Corbin's face, the crack of bone sharp and ugly. Corbin staggered back, blood pouring from his nose. His eyes, full of shock and rage, found Alara. "You!" he snarled and lunged toward her. Silas roared, a sound of pure protective instinct. He threw himself at his former deputy, ignoring the fire in his back and arm. They fell heavily, Silas on top. He drove his fist into Corbin's face once, twice, a final, definitive blow that ended the fight. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the lonely whistle of the wind through the broken window. The last rider had already fled, a disappearing speck on the horizon. The floor was a wreck of shattered pottery, spilled water, and blood. Silas pushed himself off Corbin's still form, his strength failing. He slumped against the wall, sliding to the floor, leaving a smear of red on the timber. He looked at his arm, then at his back where the wounds had reopened, then at Alara. Her face was pale, her knuckles white on the rifle stock, but she was standing. She was whole. He had come to her home and brought death with him, and she had not broken. She had not run. She met his gaze across the ruined room, and in that look, 1,000 words were exchanged. Words of gratitude, of shared pain, of a future that was no longer empty. The fight was over, but the war for their souls had just been won. Alara slowly lowered the rifle. She walked to the hearth, where the fire had burned down to embers again. She carefully added a few small pieces of kindling, coaxing the flames back to life. She didn't look at the body on the floor. She didn't look at the destruction. She looked at the fire, a symbol of the warmth and light she had refused to let be extinguished. Then, she turned, her movements no longer hesitant but filled with a quiet purpose. She went to Silas, knelt beside him and began once more to tend to his wounds. The sun was higher now, its light pouring through the shattered window and the broken door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a harsh, unforgiving light, but for the first time, it did not feel like an accusation. It felt like a promise. They were two scarred, solitary people in a ruined cabin, and the world was still a dangerous place. But as the new day dawned, they were not alone.